when FDR called to build this New Deal society, right?
Yeah.
He called for people to help him build these institutions, and all these New Dealers signed up in mass to staff these new agencies
Right.
or do these public work projects. And it seems like in my opinion, that was like the biggest thing that I took from your book on what the left should sort of take from FDR is this idea of like building institutions that maybe didn't exist there before, using your power to establish new things, whether it's like community aid or public works projects or public housing, you know. Could you speak to that and how that all took place?
Yeah. Well, in favor of tweeting recently, I came to the point of saying, FDR's presidency, the New Deal presidency, and the war effort presidency, it really involved 4 R's. It was, I'll state each of them and then I'll explain what I mean. Relief, reconstruction, reform, and recovery. So relief is that immediate imperative to make sure people can survive. And I'll put it in contemporary terms, our own terms today. So if Joe Biden pursues anything in the first weeks and months of the presidency that he's just now secured, it has to be combating the pandemic. And in those terms, combating the unemployment, enabling Americans who have jobs to get back to work. Okay, that's for a start. Relief, we'll call it. He calls it, I think, a rescue plan, but it's relief. The second, reconstruction, is to launch major public works projects. Okay, and there we can refer to the Civilian Conservation Corps that young men and boys were invited into, the Civil Works Administration, which provided emergency relief, you might say, in that early years of this administration. But beyond that, the Works Progress Administration, which was a massive set of endeavors to do everything from building roads to building hospitals to building schools to building parks, and to get involved even in even more grander, if you like, kinds of projects. And then the other one was the PWA, the Public Works Administration, which gave contracts to pursue the construction of dams, big bridges, tunnels, that kind of stuff. I mean, the American landscape was transformed during the New Deal, and the national infrastructure was modernized. As we said before, rural electrification and that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's reconstruction. And by the way, part of that reconstruction involved combating, you and I are both here in the upper Midwest, but the lower Midwest, the plain states, suffered terrible droughts in the 1930s. Whole stretches of Oklahoma and Kansas and maybe Texas were turned into a dust bowl. So they also fought that by planting massive numbers of trees. The CCC and other agencies planted like 3 billion trees in the course of the Roosevelt years. Okay, then there's reform. And this is really important, okay? Reform would be, for example, the fact that the Roosevelt administration, from the very start in the National Industrial Recovery Act, and even more significantly in the National Labor Relations Act, signed into law the guarantee that government would enable and empower workers to organize labor unions, to stand up to their bosses and to pursue what's called industrial democracy, giving workers a voice, not only in contracts, but in the workplace itself. And similarly, the enactment of Social Security, that realization, something that he had promised to pursue, to not publicly, but he had promised actually he did talk about creating Social Security even as he was campaigning. And in 1935, he signed into law the Social Security Act, which basically was to combat poverty amongst the elderly, to do something about protecting families with a single parent household. I mean, and also to enable the disabled, to pursue lives that were decent. Okay, so it was multifaceted. And then last but not least, and I used to think of it as the first thing they pursued, was recovery. But now I'm actually convinced that recovery was impossible without also having done relief first, without pursuing reconstruction and providing jobs and getting that economy moving and enabling America to rebuild itself, and reform, empowering workers. Because By empowering workers, you enabled them to demand higher wages. And when they demanded higher wages, it meant that farmers could sell their products to survive at reasonable prices. And also, and this is really important, it meant that factories could be reopened, okay, not only to provide jobs, but that people could afford to buy what they were producing. So there you go, 4 R's: relief, reconstruction, reform, and recovery. Those are the 4 R's, I think, especially of the New Deal years. But I'll also add, labor unions grew even larger, and because in the war years, okay, workers wanted to be organized. They wanted the dignity that labor provided. They wanted the protection that unions could provide in the workplace. And especially during the war effort years, women who had already been involved in unionism were an ever larger base of the union movement because of the fact that so many men were being called into service to fight the war.